Well, good morning. Welcome to Compass, our mission's navigating people to God. My name is Nate. I taught MC Hammer all of his dance moves. So, hey, we're glad that you're here. Glad you're worshiping with us. And if you're a guest, an extra special welcome to you today. And I would love to meet you after the service is over. So please stop by Next Steps on your way out. And just let us know how you got here. We'd love to connect with you in that way. Also, just want to make a reminder that we're in the middle of our 21 Days of Prayer Challenge. And today, after this service is over at 12:30, over at the land, which is just across 287, we're going to have a special time of prayer on the land there. The weather's looking good, so the rain's holding off till about 4. So we're going over there. We're going to spend some time praying. We've paid off the land, and now we're looking towards construction. And so, yeah, we can celebrate that. And so we want to spend some time asking that God's favor would continue to be upon this campus, and that's what we're going to do during that time. So I hope you'll join us for that today. Well, you know, a few years ago, a friend of mine, he suggested this book called Shoe Dog, which was written by the founder and creator of Nike. And me being the sneakerhead that I am, I was like, man, I got to get that book. I want to hear Phil Knight's story. And so I picked up the book and I started to read it. And you know, whether or not you have Nikes on right now, or maybe you have some Nikes at home in your closet, or you've got some Nike apparel that you wear, we all know about Nike. We all know, and we can recognize that symbol, but it didn't start out that way. In fact, all the way back in 1963, Phil Knight actually started the company out of the back of his car. And what was interesting to me is that he had to borrow the first $50 to get the company started from his dad. And now we look at Nike and it's become this worldwide brand. In fact, Nike is so iconic today that we see that swoosh and we know exactly what it means. It's become this $30 billion a year company. But you know, Knight's story of success is one that didn't start out from like this big beginnings. It was a story that is truly a dark horse story. And when all the other shoe companies around were not threatened by Nike, Nike has become this symbol that everyone knows and everyone can recognize. But how did this happen? You know, I love what Knight said in his book about this. Listen to these words. He said, deep down, I was searching for something else. Something more. I had this aching sense that our time is short, shorter than we ever know, short as a morning run, and I wanted mine to be meaningful and purposeful and creative and important. Above all, different. I wanted to leave a mark on the world. You know, as I read that, I thought, man, that last line is so good. Because here's my hope for you through this series. My hope through this series that we're in called Dark Horses is that you too would be able to leave your mark on the world in a powerful way, because you would take this challenge seriously to be used by God the way that he calls each of us to. And you know, we've been talking about through this series how God uses ordinary people to do some extraordinary things. And what I want you to hear through this series is this, that God can use you. Because I believe that in this room, sitting in these chairs today, are people whose dark horse stories have yet to be told, and God simply wants you to step up in faith. Now, we said at the beginning of this series that a dark horse is defined as a little known person who's unlikely to succeed, who ultimately accomplishes great things. And we've looked at 2 dark horse stories already. We looked at the story of this guy named Nehemiah, whose heart broke for his hometown, and he had to do something about it. And one of the questions that I asked you to consider and think about is, what is it that breaks your heart? And we're gonna come back to that question next week. And then last week, we looked at the story of a guy named Moses, who had a whole bunch of excuses that he had to let go of so that God could use him. And just like these guys that we've already looked at and these stories that we've been digging into, we have to understand that our dark horse stories cannot be told and they cannot be written until we allow God to use each and every one of us. And I think it's safe to say we all want that kind of story, don't we? I mean, we all want to do something that is life-changing. We want to do something that makes an impact, but sometimes we don't feel like it's attainable, and so we just lose hope. I think one of the reasons this happens in our lives is because, honestly, we tend to feel inadequate in certain areas of our life. I know this is something that I struggle with in my own life. It's something that I wrestle with from time to time. And there's certain moments in my life where I just think that maybe I don't have what it takes. And maybe you've had those thoughts as well. Maybe for some of you here today, the feelings of inadequacy in your life come when it comes to your finances. Like you look at your life and how much money you make and you compare it to somebody else and you think, we'll never measure up to that. Or maybe it's your image is how you feel inadequate. Like you don't like the you that looks back at you when you look in the mirror. Or for students, maybe it's just you feel inadequate in the classroom. You compare yourself to others and you look at their grades or their grade point average or their class rank and you think, I could never get to that. And you can feel inadequate. Or maybe it's as an athlete, comparing yourself to other athletes. You're like, I can never measure up to that. Or maybe it's in your parenting or in your career. Or maybe it's as a family, comparing your family to other families. Let me ask you this. Have you ever felt spiritually inadequate? Like you see these Christian Ken Jennings of the world and you look at them and they know everything. They know book, chapter, and verse. And they're like, oh yeah, they can quote it all. And they're like, oh, that's from Zephaniah. And you're like, I didn't even know Zephaniah existed in the Bible. Or maybe they say a prayer and you're like, man, that prayer was so powerful. Like God's got to be clapping like Drake is at a Raptors game, right? Like that's how exciting it was. You know what I'm talking about? You know those people, right? Or maybe you feel inadequate when it comes to sharing your faith. Like you're like, I don't know if I can share my story. And what if I share my story and then someone asks questions and I don't know how to answer them? I think we all have those areas in our life where we feel inadequate and we just don't know how we would ever attain those things. And I talk to people all the time who are dealing with this, who are wrestling with this. And what I tell them is this. In fact, this is not something that is unusual for anyone here today. Because we all have those moments in our life where we just don't feel like we can measure up. It's one of the reasons why as your pastor, one of the things that I want to do is I always want to be transparent. I always want to be as open and honest as I can be about my own struggles and the things that I deal with in life, because I think sometimes people see pastors as a superhero who've got it all together, but that's not the case. That I'm just a normal, average guy who deals with and struggles with inadequacy just like you. And I think we all have those areas in our life where we're just like, I don't know if I've got what it takes. Now, let me give you a couple of reasons why I think this is the case. The first one I would say is this. It's because of unrealistic criticism that we receive. Maybe somebody's told you you're not good enough or you're not cut out for that or you don't have what it takes. And that unrealistic criticism can cause you to feel as though you are inadequate in areas of your life. I remember when I was in 8th grade, I was trying out for the 8th grade school basketball team, and I remember the coach didn't really like me that much. And so even though I had been a starter on the 7th grade A team and was one of the best players on the team, the coach the next year told me I wasn't good enough, I wasn't fast enough, and I probably wouldn't be playing basketball anymore. And I remember those words, they sunk in, that criticism, it hurt so much, and I almost gave up on my basketball career completely. But there were other people who spoke life into me, who said, no, don't give up on this. Keep trying. Keep doing what you've been doing. Keep practicing. And because of that, I ended up going to college. I ended up playing for my college that I went to, and I got to be on the team that ended up 5th in the country my last season. And it was incredible. But you see, unrealistic criticism almost got the best of me. Another thing that can cause us to feel inadequate is unrealistic compliments. Has someone ever told you, like, you're a rock star, you're amazing, you're the greatest thing since sliced bread? I mean, like, that's kind of corny, right? But that's some people will say that. And you hear those things and you think to yourself, man, I am pretty good, but then we also think, but if they really knew who I was, deep down inside, they would know that that's not the case. And sometimes those unrealistic compliments can cause us to feel like if we fail, then we've let other people down. And I think the fear of failure will cause you to be afraid to try new things. And that kind of thing, that unrealistic compliments, and it can actually lead and drive inadequacy in your life. The third thing that drives inadequacy is unrealistic comparison. And I think we can all be guilty of this, right? Like we all are comparing ourselves to others. We want to be better. We want to be smarter. We want to be richer. We want to be prettier. We want to be more handsome. We want to be skinnier. And so what do? We begin to compare ourselves to other people. In fact, like social media, it has been a kind of a dangerous thing that I think has kind of crept up on us and causes us to compare even more. Like I see people all the time, like out in public, like they got their phone out, they're doing duck lips, like 60 different times before they get the right one, right? And then that's the one they post, or they put the Snapchat filters on their picture because they want to look better than maybe what the picture on their phone actually captures. Or maybe you do this, you compare the number of followers you have on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or Snapchat or whatever it is, TikTok. I mean, social media has caused us to lead this life of comparison with others. And I'm not immune to this in my own life. I'm guilty of this. In fact, on Mondays, sometimes like these churches that I have friends that work at, I follow them on different social media platforms, and they all post their pastor's messages on Mondays. And so sometimes I'll just click on one and I'll watch like the 2-minute review. And as I'm watching it, I'll be like, ooh, I wouldn't have said it that way. Or I'm like, oh man, you messed that joke up. That would have been a lot funnier if you did this. Or, ooh, if you're wearing that outfit, you got to wear those J's, not those J's, right? Like, and I'm like comparing other pastors to myself. And I think comparison is something we can so easily use as this tool that makes us feel inadequate. And you see, Satan knows this. In fact, you know what Satan does? To render you useless, he doesn't need to corrupt you. He just needs to get you to start comparing. Now here's the good thing. We don't have to let inadequacy have the final say in our lives. And I want to show you that today through a story of this guy named Gideon. That's our next dark horse story. If you've got a Bible or a Bible app, we're going to be in Judges chapter 6 today. And just to give you a little bit of background into this story, it's Judges chapter 6. We find this guy named Gideon. But what's been happening is in Israel, or the Israelite people, what's been happening is they've been turning their backs from God. And every time they turn their backs from God, this enemy nation comes and attacks them. And what do? Then they cry out to God for help. God, please save us. Would you send someone to help us out? And so what does God do? God sends what's called a judge to deliver the Israelites, and they get delivered, and then what happens is they go back to doing what they had done before. They go back and they start turning their backs on God, then another nation comes, and then they cry out. And so this cycle repeats over and over again. And so this has happened multiple times by the time we get to Gideon. Now, Gideon is a guy who will, in fact, he will deliver the Israelite people from the hands of this enemy nation, the Midianites. And the story of how it happens is truly incredible. It's a dark horse story. In fact, what Gideon does is he takes 300 men and he goes into battle against an army of 100,000 and he defeats them. It's the original 300 movie script. And if you've heard the story of Gideon, this is the part of the story that you've probably heard the most, or the story that you've been taught. But I want to look at a different part of Gideon's life. It's the story before his story of victory that I think can help us today when it comes to dealing with inadequacy in our lives. You see, before Gideon is used by God to defeat the Midianites, Gideon dealt with his own inadequacy in some areas of his life, and there's 3 things that God tells him that I think can help us as we overcome that in our own lives as well. And so look at what it says starting in chapter 6, verse 11 here. It says, "Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree of Oprah, which belonged to Joash. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of the winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites." Now, this verse, it tells us that Gideon is threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress. Now, there's a problem with what Gideon is doing here. He's threshing wheat in a winepress. Now, if you hear winepress, what do you think a winepress was actually used for? Okay, somebody's paying attention, right? Wine, right? That's where you make wine. But Gideon is threshing wheat in a winepress. This isn't where you thresh wheat, though. The threshing of wheat was actually done on high ground. It was done out in the open so that a breeze could come through. And what you would do is you would throw the wheat up in the air, and the good wheat, which was the heavier part, it would fall to the ground, but the wind would blow the chaff away. That's how you threshed wheat. But that's not what Gideon is doing. What Gideon is doing is he's hiding underground. He's hiding the wheat from the Midianites, it says. Now, why is he doing this? The reason is this dude is just simply afraid of the enemy that is coming after him. And I don't know about you, but this doesn't sound like much of a hero to me. But catch what God says to Gideon next, verse 12. It says, "When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, 'The Lord is with you, mighty warrior.'" Now, as I read that, I just kind of laughed a little bit, like, mighty warrior, really? I mean, this guy is hiding behind a tree. He's down in a ditch. He's afraid of his enemies, and he doesn't want to be attacked by them. This is not a mighty warrior in my mind. And even as God calls Gideon this mighty warrior, I wonder if Gideon had to laugh a little bit. like he had to be thinking to himself, God, I don't see myself as a mighty warrior. I mean, you could describe me as a mighty wuss right now, but not mighty warrior. But this is what's so cool about this story. And I think what we have to understand. You see, what we see in ourselves isn't what God sees. And I love that God calls Gideon, he calls him a mighty warrior. Because Gideon was a farmer. That was his job. But this is what struck me here. Like this kind of set out to me like, man, this is so good. And we've got to understand this in our own lives as well. You see, God doesn't call us what we are. God calls us what we can be. He saw something different in Gideon. And if we want to overcome these feelings of inadequacy in our life, then I think we can learn some things from Gideon's story. The first thing that we learn is this: God sees so much more in you than you see in yourself. Like right now, I guarantee you that God sees so much more in you than you will ever be able to see in yourself. Because I believe in this room, there are some of you who don't see yourselves as a good husband or a good wife. Some of you, you may not see yourself as a good mom or a good dad. You might not see yourself as a good son or a daughter. You might not see yourself as a good employee. Some of you might label yourself as an outcast or someone who is unwanted. You might even walk through the doors today and you're like, I don't even know if God can love me because of my past. And so you might label yourself as unlovable. But you see, that's not how God sees you. In fact, here's what I think we all need to hear today. God sees so much more in you than you will ever be able to see in yourself. And I believe that just like Gideon, there are some of you here today that God has gifted you to do something incredible, something amazing for him, but you've allowed fear and worry to consume and control your thoughts, and it's hindered you from what God is really calling you to. In fact, you might even be here today and you might be holding back from what God is calling you to do because you have these feelings of inadequacy in your life. But you see, just like Gideon, I believe there's something that God wants us to hear today. And I love our lead pastor, Pastor Drew, he tells our staff this all the time. And I think we need to remind ourselves of this as well. We need to be warriors, not worriers. Be a warrior, not a worrier. And you know, I love when people step up and step out in faith to what God is calling them to, and they decide to be a warrior rather than to be a warrior. And usually how the conversation goes is like this. They're like, you know what, I never saw myself doing that, but then I did. I just trusted God and I trusted him with the results, and because of it, I was able to do something I never thought was possible in my life. You know, a few weeks ago, we asked one of our North Fort Worth members if she would be willing to be one of our hosts. And when we asked her, she said, you know, I don't really know if I feel comfortable doing that. Like that's really, I don't know if that's my gift. Can I pray about it? And so she prayed about it for a few days, and she came back to Rob and she said, you know what, I've been praying about this, and because you asked me to do this, I feel like that's God telling me I'm supposed to do this, and I'm gonna go ahead and I'm just gonna trust God with the results. And you see, I love that because that's the kind of mindset that we have, that we've got to be willing to let go of our fears and worries so that God can use us the way that he sees fit. And you know, that's easier said than done though, isn't it? Because you and I, we all have this inner voice in our head that tells us we don't have what it takes, that we're not cut out for something, and so we tend to avoid it. Even when we hear this phrase, be a warrior, not a worrier, I think our natural instinct is to go, nah, I'm good. Thanks, God. You know what? There's a bunch of other warriors in the church. They'll be the warriors. I'll just sit back in the corner. I'm good on this one. I'm going to sit this one out. And that's what we see Gideon do. Like he's just trying to get out of this because he doesn't think he's that guy. But look at what it says in verse 13. Sir, Gideon replied, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say, the Lord brought us up out of Egypt, but now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites? Here Gideon's like, excuse me, God, but in my entire life, I haven't seen any attributes. I haven't seen anything that would describe me as a mighty warrior. Like when I think of a warrior, God, I'm thinking of like Arnold Schwarzenegger in The Terminator, because that dude has some muscles and I'm just weak. I got no muscle. Like God, I'd just rather just stay down in the wine press and mind my own business. That's kind of what I'm cool with. And you see, you got to realize this. If you want to overcome this inadequacy in your life, you can't allow these excuses to weigh you down. And maybe you felt like this when God's maybe calling you to something. Have you ever said like, hey God, I hear what you're saying, but I think you got the wrong person for the job? That's what Moses did last week, right? He made every excuse that he could not to do what God is calling him to do. And not to follow through with what God was calling him to. And we do the same thing. But notice what God says to Gideon in response. Verse 14 says, then the Lord turned to him and he said, go with the strength that you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you. Now God turns to Gideon like a parent does when a kid makes an excuse and he gives them the raised eyebrow look like the Rock, like, excuse me, right? Would you just go and do what I've called you to? I think the problem is this though. Sometimes when we hear the word go, what we think that means is go get more schooling. Go get more training. Go and fix your life so that you can be used by me. That's what I think we hear God say when we hear the words go. But catch what God says there. He simply says this. He says, go with the strength that you have. God's like, I've already given you everything that you already need. I've already given you the necessary strength, which then I think leads to the second thing that we have to understand about what God says to us when we're dealing with this inadequacy in our lives, and that is this. We've got to realize that God has already given you more than you can imagine. You might not think that you have any gifts that can be used by God. You may not think that your talents and abilities are that great, and so you just make these excuses for not being used by him. But you see, the problem like Gideon is that we've allowed fear and worry and these feelings of inadequacy to tell us something different than what God's telling us. You see, like Gideon, I believe that God might be telling some of you, it's time to go. It's time to step up. But you've resisted because you don't think you have what it takes. You see, you've got to stop letting these voices tell you something different than what God tells you. And look, I get it. Like, you might not be an upfront person, but that doesn't mean we don't need behind the scenes people to do things. God needs behind the scenes people. You may not be the boss, but that doesn't mean that you can't lead from your position at your workplace. You might not be the oldest person on your team, but that doesn't mean you still can't have influence. Stay-at-home moms, you may not think that you can have an influence in the life of anyone, but you know what? You have the opportunity to influence your kids each and every day, probably more than anyone else. Maybe you grew up in a broken family. It doesn't mean that you can't write a different story. You could be the one that breaks the cycle of your family history by changing the narrative. Don't tell God you can't do something because you don't have something. Go do something with what God has given to you. Don't let your past tell you that you're not good enough, that you can't do it. In fact, I would argue this, that your past is the best indicator of how God can use you. If you were a former addict, there's no one who is more qualified, I believe, to help those who are struggling with that stronghold in their life. So why not be a part of AA or Celebrate Recovery and help others find the freedom that you found? If you were once the victim of an abusive relationship, there's no one better to help stand in the gap for those who are trying to find a way out. If you were a high schooler who once partied too much and lived a broken life, there is no one better in my mind to help those students who are going through those same things in their life find Jesus and live this life for him. You see, your past is not meant to be a stain on your record, but an indicator of how God can use you. And that's what God's about to show Gideon here in these next few verses. Look at what it says in verses 15 and 16. It says, but the Lord replied, but Lord, Gideon replied, how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I'm the least in my entire family. And the Lord said to him, I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. Now, catch what Gideon does here. Like I think, like, as I'm reading this is like Gideon's Napoleon Dynamite moment, right? He's like, gosh, God, like, why do you have to choose me? Like, I'm the weakest in all of my family. My family's the weakest in all the tribes. Gosh, you pick somebody else. Like, that's how I think that dude's talking right there, right? All right. But God's response is, I'll be with you. All right, you got to get back on track. Like, here's what God's showing Gideon as well as us. God working through you is less about you than you think. Philippians chapter 2, verse 13 says this, for God is working in you, giving you the desire and the power to do what pleases him. I think this is good news when you think about it. See, it's less about us actually doing something and allowing God to work through us. Like I know this to be true. I experience this on a regular basis every single Sunday. As I shared last week, I struggle. Like I'm not a great like public speaker. It doesn't come naturally to me. Like I could just get up here and preach a message. Some guys can just walk up and they can just share what is on their heart and it comes out and it makes sense. That's not me. I fumble over my words. I struggle sometimes. But what I've realized is on Sunday mornings, what I've had to come to realize is it's so much less about me and so much more about God. And I decided a long time ago that I was just gonna let go and I was gonna let God take control. And so when I'm getting ready to speak, I'm usually sitting on the front row and I'm trying not to listen to Anthony's terrible jokes, right? And so I'm praying and I'm like, God, would you just speak through me? God, would you just use me? Would these be your words and not mine? And would you just help me get out of the way? And you see, when I've let go and I let God take control, I've seen him work in my life in some incredible ways. And I know that God wants to do the same thing in your life as well. You see, you just got to be willing to step out in faith and remind yourself, like, I can't allow inadequacy to have the final say. I've just got to trust God with the results. And I think you have to remind yourself of these things that God told Gideon. The first thing is this: God sees so much more in you than you see in yourself. God's given you more than you can ever imagine. And then the third thing that I think we've got to say is this: God working through you depends a whole lot more on God than it does on you. And you see, if you will remember these things and you will tell yourself these things each and every day, when you start dealing with those moments of inadequacy, when you're like, I don't know if I can do this, I don't know, God, like I hear what you're saying, I know what you're calling me to, but I just don't know. I promise you this: if you will tell yourself those things, inadequacy will not have the final say in your life. So let me ask you this as we close out today. What are you not attempting to do that God has called you to? What are you not attempting to do that God has called you to? Maybe for someone here today, God's telling you, you know what? It's time to share your faith with your friend. It's time to share your faith with your family. It's time to share your faith with the neighbor that needs to hear about the hope that is Jesus. And it's time to step out. For some of you, maybe what God's telling you to do is it's time to step up and mentor those kids that your heart breaks for. It's time to do it. Maybe for a family here, it's time to adopt, or it's time to open your home to be a foster care home because you have a heart that breaks for those that are in the system that don't have a place to call home. Maybe what God's calling you to do is to start a ministry or a nonprofit for that thing that breaks your heart. Maybe he's calling you to start a community group and help others find community here at Compass North Fort Worth, because we need each other. We can't do this thing called life alone. Students, maybe he's calling you to be a leader in your school, whether that's Eaton High School or Adams or Wilson, or if you go to Eagle Mountain, Saginaw, or if you go to Keller schools, or you go to Decatur schools. Wherever you come from, God may be calling you to be a leader, to step up and to change the culture in your school. For some of you, I believe maybe God's calling you to use your gifts to serve, both here at Compass North Fort Worth and outside with maybe one of our ministry partners. Maybe God's calling you to be a leader in your workplace, to step up and to influence it in a powerful way. Maybe God's calling you to be generous with what you have to help others who are in need. Maybe he's calling you to go on a mission trip like you've never stepped foot off of U.S. soil, and he's calling you to go to a place that feels unfamiliar and really uncomfortable to you. Maybe God's calling you to do that. For some of you, maybe God's calling you to follow him with your life for the first time. You know, my prayer for some of you is that is what you would do at the end of this series. That because of what you've heard, because you hear about this God who loves you, who cares for you, who walks alongside of you, that you would decide to follow him with your life, and you would make a decision to accept him and be baptized. And at the end of this series on March 1st, we're having a decision day that day, and maybe you would take a step of faith and follow Jesus with your life. I promise you, if you will do that, it'd be the best decision that you could ever make here on this earth. And so if that's something that you're interested in talking more about, we'd love to talk to you about that. Stop by Next Steps on your way out. We want to talk to you about how you can take that step of faith and what that looks like for you. Let me ask you this again. What is it that God is calling you to do that you haven't attempted? I don't know what it is for each and every person here, but I believe that God wants to do something more through us here at Compass North Fort Worth. I feel that God wants us to start a movement, not just in the North Fort Worth area, but with all of our campuses at Compass, to impact the DFW area and beyond. And I know it can happen. In fact, I am believing it can happen, and I'm praying it would happen, because there would be a whole bunch of dark horses that are sitting in this room right now that would step out in faith, and they would just go where God is calling them to go. So let me ask you one more time. What is it that God's calling you to do that you haven't attempted? It's time to step up. It's time to step out. And it's time to go, because there's a dark horse story that's going to be told through those who are willing to take those steps of faith and go where God leads. Are you willing to go? What are you going to attempt to do that God has called you to, that maybe you've said, thanks, but no thanks, God? Where are you going to go? There's a dark horse story for you. You've just got to follow God's plan for your life. We pray. Would you pray with me? Father, today we come to you, and we thank you for a story of a guy like Gideon, who shows us that we can overcome the inadequacy that we face in life if we just trust you with the results. And because Gideon was willing to trust you, God, that you took 300 men and you took down an army of 100,000. God, I don't know what it is that's standing in front of us, but I know that God is calling us to be mighty warriors, to step out and to go where you want us to go. And Lord, I just pray that you would give us the courage and the boldness to do that. Wherever it is that you might be speaking to us now, God, right now, God, I pray that you would give us the strength that we need, the energy that we need, the courage that we need, the boldness that we need to step out and step into your calling. God, I pray for those here today who maybe need to take that step of faith to follow you with their life. I pray that this series would be one that they would take that step that would change their life forever, and that you would begin to write their dark horse story. God, we thank you for your love for us, and we pray these things in your name. Amen.